The sheriff's deputy was trying not to laugh as Karen Williams stood there in her designer hiking boots, pointing at my camping gear and demanding I be arrested for trespassing on my own property. "Officer, this man has been illegally camping on protected community land for 3 days," she announced, waving her tablet like it was evidence in a murder trial. "He's violated multiple environmental regulations and refused to leave despite clear notices from the HOA. Deputy Martinez looked at me sitting by my campfire, then at Karen, then back at me. "Sir, can you show me some identification and proof you have permission to be here?" I reached into my tackle box and pulled out my driver's license and property deed. "Here's my ID and here's the deed showing I own this entire lake and about 500 acres around it." The deputy examined the documents while Karen's face went from confident to confused to bright red in about 10 seconds. "Ma'am, this gentleman appears to own the property you're asking me to remove him from." "That's impossible," Karen shrieked. "This is community recreation land managed by the Pine Ridge HOA. I have the documentation right here." She started frantically scrolling through her tablet, looking for papers that would prove she was right and I was wrong. But I knew she wouldn't find them because they didn't exist. "Karen," I said calmly, stirring the coals in my fire pit, "you might want to check those documents again. Because unless something changed while I was asleep, I still own every inch of this lake and everything around it for half a mile in every direction." That was 3 months ago. Today, Karen and her entire fake HOA board are packing up their illegal office building and moving it off my land before the bulldozers arrive tomorrow morning. But let me start from the beginning because this story gets better with every detail. My name is Jake Morrison and I inherited Clearwater Ranch from my grandfather 5 years ago. It's a beautiful piece of property in northern Montana, 847 acres of forest, meadows, and a pristine 40-acre lake that's been in our family since 1923. My grandfather bought this land during the Depression when nobody else wanted it. Too remote, too wild, too far from town. He built a small cabin on the ridge overlooking the lake and spent his retirement years fishing, hunting, and keeping the property exactly the way nature intended. When he passed away, he left everything to me with one simple instruction written in his will: keep it wild and keep it free. I live in Denver most of the year working as a software engineer, but I come up to the ranch every few months to check on things, do maintenance, and reconnect with the land my grandfather loved. Sometimes I stay in the old cabin, sometimes I pitch a tent by the lake. It's my property, my choice. The trouble started 2 years ago when a developer built Pine Ridge Estates, a gated community about 2 miles from my eastern property line. 50 houses for rich folks who wanted to get back to nature, without actually getting dirty. At first they kept to themselves. But as more people moved in, they started noticing my lake. You can see it from some of the houses on the ridge, and apparently several residents had assumed it was part of their community amenities. The first hint of trouble came when I found a group of Pine Ridge residents having a picnic on my dock. Nice people, friendly enough, but they seemed genuinely surprised when I told them they were on private property. "Oh, we thought this was the community lake," said a woman in expensive hiking gear. "The HOA told us it was available for resident use." "The HOA told you wrong," I replied politely. "This is private property. Has been for almost a century." They apologized and left, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Someone had definitely told them they had access to my lake. A week later I found more people. This time it was a family with kids, fishing off my dock with gear they'd obviously just bought. Again they seemed shocked to learn they were trespassing. But the community manager said residents could use the lake for recreation, the father protested. "We even paid a lake access fee as part of our HOA dues." That's when I realized someone was deliberately lying to these people and taking their money for access to property they didn't own. I started asking questions. Who was this community manager? What exactly had the HOA told residents about lake access? Where was this information documented? The answers I got were disturbing. The Pine Ridge HOA had been telling residents that my lake was community-adjacent recreational water that came with their property purchase. They've been collecting $200 per household annually for lake maintenance and access fees. Do the math. 50 households times $200 equals $10,000 per year that someone was collecting for access to my private lake. I decided it was time to have a conversation with this HOA. The Pine Ridge Community Office was a fancy building at the entrance to their gated neighborhood. All glass and stone, designed to look like a mountain lodge but with the sterile feeling of a corporate headquarters. I walked in and asked to speak with whoever was in charge of the lake access program. That's when I met Karen Williams. Karen was the HOA president, a woman in her early 50s who had apparently moved to Pine Ridge to escape the stress of city life. She had that aggressive confidence of someone who was used to being in charge and didn't like being questioned. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested helping me was the last thing she wanted to do. "I'm Jake Morrison. I own Clearwater Lake, and I understand you've been telling residents they have access to my property." Karen's expression didn't change. "Mr. Morrison, I think there's been some confusion. The Lake Access Program refers to community water features within the Pine Ridge development." "No confusion on my end. Your residents have been showing up on my dock with fishing gear, telling me you charged them for lake access. I'm not sure what residents you're referring to, but Pine Ridge has no programs involving private property." I could tell she was lying, but I decided to give her one chance to fix the situation peacefully. "Karen, let me be very clear. My family has owned that lake for almost a century. I have the deed, I pay the taxes, and I don't allow public access. If your HOA has been telling people otherwise, you need to correct that immediately. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but Pine Ridge operates within all legal boundaries. If you have specific complaints about trespassing, I suggest you contact local law enforcement." "I'm not making complaints yet. I'm giving you the opportunity to stop misleading your residents before this becomes a legal issue." Karen stood up, which I guess was supposed to intimidate me. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private community office and you're not a resident." I left, but I was far from done. Karen had basically told me she was going to keep lying to her residents and keep collecting money for access to my property. That was fraud and I wasn't going to tolerate it. Over the next few months, I documented everything. Every time I found Pine Ridge residents on my property, I took photos and got their names. Every conversation about lake access I recorded. Every HOA document that mentioned the lake program I collected copies. What I discovered was even worse than I'd thought. The Pine Ridge HOA wasn't just collecting access fees. They had created an entire fake narrative about community water rights and environmental stewardship that made it sound like they were protecting the lake for everyone's benefit. Their website had a whole section about Pine Ridge Lake Conservation, with photos of my lake and descriptions of ongoing habitat restoration funded by community contributions. They had even hired a part-time lake management coordinator, whose job was apparently to collect money for taking care of someone else's property. But the most outrageous thing was what I found in their community newsletter. There was an article titled "Responsible Lake Usage Guidelines" that laid out rules for residents using community water resources. My lake wasn't a community resource. It was my private property. But Karen and her HOA board had convinced 50 families that they owned a piece of it. That's when I decided to go camping. I wanted to spend a long weekend at the lake, partly for the peace and quiet, but mostly to see how the HOA would react to my presence on my own land. I packed my gear, drove up to the ranch, and set up a nice campsite right on the shore where anyone could see it. The first day was perfect. I fished in the morning, hiked in the afternoon, and sat by the fire in the evening reading a book and enjoying the silence. No trespassers, no drama, just me and my lake. The second day, a Pine Ridge resident showed up with his kayak. He saw my campsite and immediately got that worried look people get when they think they're in trouble. "Excuse me, are you allowed to camp here?" he asked nervously. The HOA said overnight camping requires special permits. "I don't need permits to camp on my own property," I replied. "But you might want to check with your HOA about whether you're allowed to kayak here." "My own property? But this is the community lake." I showed him my deed and explained the situation. He was a decent guy who had been lied to by his HOA, and he apologized for the confusion. But he also mentioned something that made my blood boil. "The HOA is planning a community fishing tournament here next month," he said. "They've been promoting it as a major fundraiser for lake conservation. A fishing tournament. On my private lake. Without my permission. With my property being used to raise money for an organization that had no legal connection to it whatsoever." That's when I knew this camping trip was going to be more interesting than I'd planned. The third day, Karen showed up. She arrived in a white SUV with 2 other people I didn't recognize, all wearing matching Pine Ridge polo shirts like they were some kind of environmental enforcement team. "Sir, you need to pack up and leave immediately," Karen announced before she was even out of her vehicle. "This is protected community land, and camping is prohibited without proper permits." I was sitting in my camp chair, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over my lake. "Good morning, Karen. Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Don't good morning me. You're trespassing on HOA property and violating multiple environmental regulations." "Karen, we've been through this. This is my property. I own it." "That's simply not true. This lake and surrounding area were designated as community conservation land when Pine Ridge was developed. I have the documentation right here. She pulled out her tablet and started reading from what sounded like an official document. Section 12 of the Pine Ridge Community Charter establishes exclusive HOA management of all water resources within the conservation boundary, including Clearwater Lake and associated riparian zones. Let me see that document. I don't have to show you anything. You're trespassing and I'm calling the sheriff. That's when Karen made the phone call that started her downfall. Yes, I need to report illegal camping on protected community land, she said to the 911 dispatcher. There's a man who's been here for 3 days, refuses to leave, and is violating environmental protection ordinances. While we waited for the deputy to arrive, Karen and her companions set up what looked like a small command post. They took photos of my campsite, measured distances from the waterline, and filled out official-looking forms on their tablets. You're documenting evidence of trespassing and environmental damage, Karen explained to her team. Make sure you get photos of the fire pit, the tent stakes, and any trash or waste. I had to admire her thoroughness, even though she was completely wrong about everything. Deputy Martinez arrived about 20 minutes later. He was a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with a property dispute on a beautiful Saturday morning. That's when I pulled out my deed and watched Karen's confident expression crumble. Ma'am, this gentleman owns the property, the deputy explained patiently. He has every right to camp here. That deed is fake, Karen said desperately. Or it's outdated. The community charter supersedes individual property claims within the conservation boundary. Ma'am, property deeds don't get superseded by HOA charters. If he owns the land, he owns the land. But we've been managing this lake for 2 years. We've invested thousands of dollars in conservation and maintenance. You've been managing someone else's property without permission, I said. And collecting money from residents for access you had no legal right to provide. The deputy was starting to understand the scope of the problem. Sir, are you saying this HOA has been charging people to use your private property? That's exactly what I'm saying. And they're planning a fishing tournament here next month to raise money for lake conservation. Deputy Martinez looked at Karen like she had just admitted to running a drug cartel. Ma'am, is that true? We've been acting in good faith to protect community resources and provide recreational opportunities for our residents. On someone else's private property? The property ownership is disputed. Ma'am, there's nothing disputed about a legal deed recorded with the county. This gentleman owns this lake. That's when Karen played her last card. She called her lawyer on speakerphone and demanded he explain to the deputy why the HOA had legitimate authority over my property. The lawyer's voice came through clearly. Karen, I told you not to do this. If that man owns the property, you need to stop this program immediately and return all the money you collected. But you said the community charter gave us management rights. I said it gave you management rights over community property. If this lake isn't community property, you've been operating illegally for 2 years. Karen hung up the phone and stood there in silence while the reality of her situation sank in. Ma'am, I strongly suggest you contact your HOA board and figure out how to resolve this legally, Deputy Martinez said. Because if Mr. Morrison decides to press charges for fraud and trespassing, you're going to have serious problems. After they left, I finished my camping trip in peace. But I spent the evenings planning my next move, because Karen's fake lake management program was going to end permanently. The first thing I did was send a certified letter to every Pine Ridge resident who had paid lake access fees. I explained that they had been charged for access to private property and provided them with copies of my deed and property surveys. The reactions were immediate and angry. Not angry at me but angry at the HOA that had been lying to them and stealing their money. Within a week, half the Pine Ridge residents had demanded refunds from the HOA. When Karen claimed the money had already been spent on lake conservation, several residents hired lawyers. The second thing I did was file complaints with the county and state about the HOA's fraudulent practices. Collecting money for services you can't legally provide is fraud, and I wanted it investigated officially. The third thing I did was research the Pine Ridge development itself. If they had been lying about my lake, what else had they been lying about? What I found was shocking. The Pine Ridge HOA had been operating beyond their legal authority in multiple ways. They had been charging fees for services they couldn't provide, claiming ownership of property they didn't own, and spending community funds on projects that benefited only the HOA board members. But the most interesting discovery was about their office building. The fancy glass and stone headquarters where Karen held her meetings was built partially on land that didn't belong to Pine Ridge. According to the property surveys, about 30% of the HOA building sat on county land that had never been purchased or leased. They had simply built their headquarters and assumed no one would notice. I contacted the county about the building violation and provided them with detailed surveys showing the encroachment. Within a month, Pine Ridge received an eviction notice for the portion of their building that was illegally occupying public land. Karen tried to fight it, of course. She hired a new lawyer and claimed the building had been legally approved by all relevant authorities. But the surveys didn't lie, and the county had never authorized anyone to build on their land. The eviction order gave Pine Ridge 60 days to move the building or have it demolished. Since you can't move half a building, they had to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it on their own property. The cost was estimated at over $200,000, which meant special assessments for all Pine Ridge residents on top of the refunds they were already demanding for the fake lake access fees. But Karen wasn't finished. Even after losing the building and facing fraud investigations, she continued to claim that the HOA had legitimate authority over my lake. She organized protests, started a social media campaign, and even convinced a local news station to do a story about corporate landowners preventing public access to natural resources. The news story backfired spectacularly when the reporter discovered that Karen had been collecting money for access to someone else's property and using it to fund her own salary as lake management coordinator. The fraud investigation concluded 6 months later with criminal charges against Karen and 2 other HOA board members. They were charged with fraud, theft, and misappropriation of community funds. Karen plea bargained to avoid jail time, but she had to pay full restitution to everyone she had defrauded and resign from all HOA positions. Her house in Pine Ridge went up for sale to cover the legal fees and damages. The Pine Ridge community eventually formed a new HOA board and hired professional management to clean up the mess Karen had created. They apologized to me publicly and established clear policies about what they could and couldn't do regarding neighboring properties. But the best part of this whole story happened last month. I was up at the ranch for a long weekend, sitting by the lake in the same spot where Karen had tried to have me arrested for camping on my own property. The new Pine Ridge management had contacted me about organizing legitimate volunteer work days to help maintain the hiking trails that crossed between our properties. It was a reasonable request from reasonable people who understood the difference between cooperation and theft. As I sat there watching the sunset over my grandfather's lake, I thought about Karen and her fake empire. She had convinced herself that wanting something badly enough made it hers. She had believed that creating official-looking documents gave her actual authority. But property rights don't work that way. You can't just decide you own something and start charging people to use it. You can't create fake management programs and steal money from people who trust you. Karen learned that lesson the hard way in criminal court, with her house being sold to pay for her crimes. These days my lake is peaceful again. I still come up for camping trips, and I've never had another HOA representative try to have me arrested for trespassing on my own land. The old Pine Ridge office building is gone, replaced by a smaller structure that sits entirely on their own property. The fake lake management program is history, and residents who want to fish have to get permission like everyone else. I even allowed the new HOA to install an information sign at the edge of my property, explaining that Clearwater Lake is private and providing contact information for anyone interested in legitimate access. Sometimes when I'm fishing, I see Pine Ridge residents on the ridge looking down at the lake with obvious longing. I feel bad for them. They were victims of Karen's fraud just as much as I was. They paid money for something they never received and trusted leaders who were lying to them. But I also think about my grandfather's instruction to keep the land wild and free. That doesn't just mean free from development or pollution. It means free from people who think they can take what doesn't belong to them and call it community service. Karen Williams thought she could steal my lake by creating fake documents and collecting fake fees. Instead, she ended up losing her house, her reputation, and her freedom. My lake is still here, still wild, still free, and still mine. And every time I camp under the stars where Karen tried to have me arrested, I remember that sometimes the best way to protect what's yours is to simply refuse to let bullies take it away.